Welcome to Impressing Mind. And today I have Erica Hamlet with Foster Care for Real. She and I connected on Instagram, and so we wanted to bring you this video regarding marriage and foster care. So, Erica, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about you?
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show, Kristen. I love technology and social media for the fact that it can connect people from faraway places. So thank you. So I'm Erica Hamlet, and I have been married to my husband, Jacob Hamlet, for 5 years this June. We're actually getting ready to leave on our anniversary trip. We planned an anniversary trip. So we're planning for that this week. So we've been married for 5 years, and I've been fostering a little bit longer than 5 years. So I was a foster parent when I met my husband. And so he kind of was faced with this decision to make of being thrown into foster care, and he had to jump on board really quick if we wanted to pursue a relationship and eventually a marriage. And so we currently have 5 kids, and our kids' ages range from 5 to 12. 4 out of our 5 are boys, and those 4 boys are all adopted. And we have one current foster care case, which is our little girl. And that will hopefully, it sounds like, be moving to adoption sometime soon, relatively soon. I think we all know that soon in the foster care world can mean so many different things. But yeah, so that will be moving to adoption. And so, yeah, our house is very busy. I homeschool 3 of our kids. 4 of our kids will be homeschooled starting this fall. So we are a pretty busy family.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that we have in common is that I also homeschool.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's awesome.
yeah. So that's another thing that I think actually helped with the attachment aspect was being consistent presence all day, every day, and helping them with their, when they're in foster care, usually they're behind academically. And so I think it just helps. You can go smaller steps and correct those learning gaps that they might have because of their background.
Absolutely. And I think I have definitely seen one of my kids, unfortunately, well, 2 of my kids have cognitive delays, but my school age child, he just was not making progress in the public school system. And I found when we pulled him into homeschool and he had that continuous one-on-one support, he jumped 2 grades within a year, just because it can be so challenging. Like when you have, we all know our brain changes because of the trauma we've gone through. So when you add that on top of maybe some sensory issues on top of missing school and you're just behind and whatever else it may be, having that one-on-one support was so beneficial. And then I tell anyone that I talk to about homeschool, like being a foster parent or an adoptive parent, the time that I get with my kids is the number one reason why we get to homeschool, because there's so much of their life before they came to us that we didn't get to be a part of. So I want to soak up all of the minutes that I can and all of the moments with them. So yeah, that's super neat.
I know. All right, so let's get into the purpose. We could have another meeting on homeschooling adopted children. We could definitely do that in the future. But our topic today is marriage. And so let's first talk about why marriage is extra difficult when you're fostering.
Well, I think we all know that marriage is generally can be very difficult, because when you take 2 people who are sinly people who act in their flesh, making one marriage work can just be challenging. Some general reasons why marriage is challenging in itself is because of the experiences we had when we were raised. We were raised by different people. We have different perspectives. We have different ideas of what our life is going to be like, different communication styles. But then when you take caring for children from hard places and you place that on top of two people who may have completely different perspectives, it adds a whole nother layer to your marriage, because now you may have had different parenting styles, but now you may, when you're a foster parent, you have trauma-informed parenting that comes into play that is going to impact your different parenting styles. The emotional and physical energy that is required to care for kids from hard places is a lot. And so biblically, we are taught that our marriage comes first. But when you're put in a real life situation where your children need that constant co-regulation, and so emotionally you are pouring into them because of, the love that you have, the reason why you have become a foster parent, that naturally takes away from the emotional energy you have to put into your partner. The piles of stress that you experience for taking care of kids from hard places. You have appointments to manage, visits to manage. You have all of the things, casework visits, court hearings that just add unnatural or not unnatural, but just add this whole nother layer of stress onto your marriage that maybe atypical marriages don't experience when you don't have kids that have, 10 therapy appointments a week, and who don't go in meltdowns multiple times and rages and conversations with schools because of academic or behavioral issues. It's just different. And I think marriage can become a lot harder because of those things, but also because you're just not prepared for them. It's very, very hard to prepare a marriage for loving kids from hard places, because chances are you've never loved a kid from a hard place before you've taken your first placement. So you can have all of the conversations, which you definitely should, but then you actually have to do the stuff. And sometimes doing the stuff is way harder than talking about the stuff. And I think that's definitely why marriage is harder when you are foster or an adoptive parent.
Yeah. So marriage is hard already.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're taking on someone else's pain and trauma and bringing that into your home. And it's, like you said, it's not the word unnatural, but it is just atypical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to be able to manage your household. You have to be able to manage your relationship on top of all the other areas, like the appointments and the running around is just overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes maybe you'll feel like, well, I'm doing all this stuff, and maybe you don't feel like the other person's pitching in. That's a normal, marriage problem. And
Right.
then you add on all these extra things that are your responsibilities to do.
Right.
And so it's just huge. So what do you think we could do before we start fostering to kind of prepare ourselves for that kind of a stress situation?
Yeah, I think, well, I know having conversations about it is going to be your number one, I think, maybe not your number one tool, but a really big tool. Because like I said before, you can have the conversations, but until you're really doing the stuff, it's going to be way different. But a little backstory on my husband and I, we got married on June 2nd of 2018. And my husband, he was like, okay, we have to promise each other we are not going to take a placement for a year into our marriage. He really wanted to advocate for putting our marriage first and building this foundation. And I was like, oh, that's lovely. How about 6 months? Let's not take a placement for 6 months. And so he agreed. He said 6 months, that's good. We took a placement 14 days after we got married. And so our marriage was really like a shotgun into the storm, into the waves, because we honestly hadn't had a lot of those conversations before. Even though I was already a foster parent, I had one placement in the time of our engagement where he got to kind of see that interaction and get a little bit of a window into the life. But it definitely, he wasn't licensed, and we had to make sure we were following licensing regulations. So it was still just me. And so when we took our little girl 14 days after we got married, we hadn't had those conversations of, who's going to take care of the appointments, and what are we going to do on a regular basis to take care of ourselves when our child may be dysregulated on a daily basis? Who's going to be the one, making the contacts with the school or the daycare when there are issues? Who's going to be doing home visits or biofamily visits? What are we going to do in order to put our marriage first? We didn't have any of those conversations because I lacked a whole lot of self-control, and I was like, yes, we're going to take her, without putting my marriage first. That was my own fault. And my first kind of lesson in marriage was I didn't put my marriage first. And, thank God that he can use our ridiculous decisions for good, because she is by far one of the best things that has ever happened to us. But definitely having those conversations, talking to other foster parents and getting their perspective on how it's impacted their marriage is also going to be very important, because real life experience and being able to have that insight to impact is going to be really beneficial. I would also recommend that if you are thinking about being a foster parent, you and your spouse, to start with respite care, start with welcoming children into your home, because that's going to give you at least some type of experience with taking care of kids who have trauma. Whether, that's just going to be for a weekend, that will be much different than a full-time placement, but that will at least give you some insight into what the impacts are going to be on your marriage. How do you guys communicate? How do you handle conflicts? How do you handle trauma triggers? What about meltdown? Like, you'll be able to gain little bits of information and little bits of tool along the way if you can do that.
That's so good. I remember we got our first placement. I totally agree about the respite. I think you should do respite for at least a year before you take on really long-term placements. But our first placement we had, she kind of like came in, we signed a paper. She was like, okay, here's all their things. Here's my number. You can call me, whatever. And then she left, and I just felt this overwhelming feeling of helplessness. Like literally someone has dropped children off for me to watch. Have really no background on what their schedule is or their likes and dislikes. It's just very overwhelming. And so we both had to just pitch in and get some stuff done. We had to, enroll them in school, and I had to buy boy stuff, because I have boys. So I had to go out and get like boy plates and cups and spoons and boy pajamas and all the things,
Right. That's such like a hidden load of taking a placement that's not discussed. Like, there's the rush of like, you get your call, you say yes, and then it's just like, Mamma mia, here we go. We have to go and get all the things. And it is. And I think too, that overwhelm, if you and your spouse haven't experienced that type of overwhelm together, you're not going to know how it impacts you differently. So when we took our little girl, I felt that exact same way, but my overwhelm put me into like this hyper vigilant mode where I was like, do. And for my husband, he kind of got put in this like, I'm going to take a step back type of mode, which is completely different and clearly would impact our marriage because we didn't even know what that emotion and that feeling was going to be like until we were there. And I'm sure, we're going to get into communication in a little bit, but we also didn't communicate about it. I wasn't like, hey, Jake, I'm feeling so overwhelmed right now with all of this planning. I need you to do this. I kind of just looked at him and I was like, we need to do this and all of these things. And, my poor husband, I also had a background in casework prior to becoming a foster parent. And so I kind of knew that checklist, and I just assumed my husband, for some reason, he would also know these checklists of the things that needed to get done, and he didn't. And I lacked so much communication in the beginning of our marriage to be able to prepare him. Thankfully, along the way in our last 5 years, we've gained those tools, but communication is definitely such an important part when you're planning to take placements of kids.
Yeah, it is important because you are in a mode almost run, trying to stay on top of everything that's going on, and you forget, like, we have got to decompress, process what's going on. What are your ideas on things? What are my ideas on things? And get on the same page for the plan of the household,
Right.
Yeah. So after you've had your foster placements for a while, maybe one of them goes back, what do you recommend in the interim period? Like, if they've gone and you say, I need at least 2 weeks or I need at least a month before I'm going to accept another placement, what are some things we can do for our marriage in that short period of time?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, you already said it, putting a boundary in place of a time to take a break, because one thing that our marriage, or in that individually, we weren't expecting, like, we knew we would feel loss and grief, but the weight of that loss and that grief. So definitely putting a boundary in place of, a child just went back home who we love and care for, and we were their mom and dad for however many days, and now we wake up and we're no longer their mom and dad. That is a heavy weight. And so putting that boundary in place and making sure you guys are both on that same page is definitely going to be the first step that I would recommend. I would recommend, depending on the circumstance or your situation, being able to take time together away. So, if you don't have any other kids in your home, then, plan a little bit of a longer vacation where you can get out of your home and your space if you are able to, and kind of be just you two, where you can talk about all of the things that you guys thought went really well, that really you struggled in, and we need area of growth. Where do we need help? Trying to notice the weaknesses within your marriage in order to strengthen them is really important. If you have kids still in your home, so maybe you can't, just go take that vacation, try and take, a weekend or a long date, get a babysitter that will stay, longer than those 3 hours, so you can go out and really have conversations about where your hearts are at, because your hearts will feel things that you probably hadn't experienced or expected once a kiddo goes home and is reunified, because you have so many mixed emotions about that reunification. So definitely giving space and grace to one another. Remembering that grief and loss affects people differently. So with me, I kind of reverted into a shell when we had 2 kiddos for little over a year and a half, and they went home, and I was just broken, and I just went into my shell. But my husband, on the other half, he experienced his grief and loss so much differently, and we had to really learn how to give each other grace for the way that we are experiencing our own grief. And so being able to do that for your spouse and that in between time is also really important. I am also a really big advocate for therapy. I think people should probably be in therapy before their foster parents, to have that support in place, but especially uh, couples therapy or just individual therapy in that interim time, or even while you are having placements, is going to be a great idea, because foster care is so complex and adoption is so complex. Wherever you are in your journey, having a outside perspective, somebody who can process those big things with you, is going to strengthen you individually and be able to strengthen your marriage.
Yeah, that's true. That's something else I would recommend. Looking back, for the 10 years or 12 years we did this, I never had a therapist. I did have a few close friends that were kind of, they knew what was going on, and they knew how much stress it was on me. But at the end, I had some really PTSD type trauma. I felt
Yep.
like I was losing it, and I couldn't keep up, and it was just very stressful. And so finally I was like, yeah, my doctor said, well, you need to talk to a therapist, and here's some medication to help, just like the full realm of things that were good for me, that I didn't want to do. I just didn't want that one more appointment, and I was against, medicine for myself. But, looking back, I was like, wow, if I had just done this all along, I
Right.
wouldn't have probably gotten to that point where I was ready to have a breakdown,
Right.
because of the one particular, the heavy kid that we were having to deal with. So, yeah, that is great advice.
Yeah.
So let's talk about communication then. We talked a little bit before about how husbands and wives communicate so differently. So how can we blend those communication styles?
Yeah.
How can we communicate better?
So with my husband and I, we really did not learn the depth of our inadequate communication until we went through a really challenging season in our marriage, where we had to fight tooth and nail for our marriage because of the big behaviors we were having in our home, the secondary traumatic stress that we were experiencing, the undealt with grief and loss that we were experiencing, but we weren't communicating about. And so that's when we ended up going into marriage therapy together. And our therapist gave us that safe place to be able to communicate. And that was really the first time we could communicate appropriately and effectively, expressing how we were feeling. We had somebody there that was guiding us through how to do that, because we both also grew up with parents who weren't the best of communicators either. And so he experienced really loud communication in his house, and I experienced a lot of withdraw communication. And so the first step in improving our communication was identifying why we both were so horrible at communicating in the first place. Because if you don't know that history within yourself, it's going to be hard to make that pivot and that change. And so that was really our first step. And we had to have really real and hard conversations with each other about communication. That there would be times where we would be like out with friends or family, and somebody would say something that was like going on in my husband's life or something, and I'd be like, what? I had no idea that was happening. And so I had to reel in my feelings of being like upset and whatnot, and be like, hey, I heard today that this was going on at work. Can you share that with me? And I had to learn how to communicate without that passive aggressiveness that I was kind of taught with my own family. And we had to schedule. So this was also a thing that I always felt so silly that I heard people talking about before our marriage or in the early years of our marriage that I thought was just, it was just silly. But we ended up having to schedule time to communicate,
Mhm.
because that's another stress of being foster and adoptive parents is your time is so precious and it is so spread thin that you really do have to schedule in time to communicate. And so we started scheduling daily meetings with each other. We learned to check in via text message with each other throughout the
Mhm.
day. I started calling my husband every single day. Like, we laugh about it now and we love it because that's kind of our thing. But he's a barber. And so I would call him and he would have clients be like, every time I sit in your chair, your wife calls you. And
Mhm.
that was just something that was birthed out of a desire to communicate with him. And so we just created and picked up those tools that may sound so simple, but really made a big impact because when you go to 10 therapy appointments a week and when you're constantly co-regulating multiple humans,
Mhm.
it is really hard to be like, hey, honey, how are you feeling today? Can you, tell me all about your day? Because you get home and you're kind of like, tag, you're it. I need a break. And then
Mhm.
he takes over and then he's like, tag, you're it. And then we put the kids to bed and then we're like, can we just sit in front of the television for hours and turn our
Yeah.
brains off? Um, and so it sounds so simple, but really it was so challenging to figure out. And that was another thing, the TV that we had to squash. We had to put firm boundaries in place with our television because we would be like, we just want to veg after a really hard day. And we had a conversation like, that's not what the Lord wants for your marriage. Like, He doesn't want you to be turning to the TV to turn off your mind. He wants you to be turning to Him and to be turning to each other to
Mhm.
communicate. And so we had to put some boundaries in place with our screen time as well. That was really, really beneficial. Um,
That's good.
yeah.
I
So,
actually,
yeah.
yeah, just this morning I was thinking, oh, if I just had another hour to do XYZ. And then immediately my answer to myself was, well, if you wouldn't watch 2 evening shows before you
Right.
fall asleep, you would have extra time. And so I also feel like the TV is it's like sometimes and there's no condemnation for anybody who uses it for like getting the kids focused for 30 minutes while you do whatever.
Right.
And so I felt like it was like that for me, like, well, I deserve to watch a show instead of being with my husband or taking time to just say, hey, let's talk or let's have a cup of coffee together or
Mhm.
whatever. Yeah.
And
That's
that
it.
was the, oh, go ahead. What was that?
I was like, that's just interesting that you brought that up right now. Perfect.
Yeah. Well, and the
Mhm.
other thing too that I think I had to learn was I wake up early. So I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's where I get like my own quiet time. And there was like this expectation that, okay, Jake, you also need to wake up early so we can have this time together. But with him, he loves sleeping in. He likes staying up late at night. So though also we have to have grace and space for one another. So sometimes he does wake up early and have that time with me. And then sometimes I push through and I tape my eyelids open and I stay up late with him, because that's what your marriage takes is being able to sacrifice and be able to see what your partner needs in order to create that space to have that communication, and to pour into them as well.
Yeah, because if you my friend explained this to me, if you pour into your husband, it's like pouring into your own flesh because you're one flesh.
Ooh,
So
I
if you
love
pour
that.
it into that person, then he in turn is going to be like, "Wow, I'm so fortunate that you're pouring all this energy into me. Let me build you up." And
Right.
because you're one flesh, so you're only building yourself up when you build up your spouse.
I love that. I'm gonna write that one down. I have sticky notes all over our house of things that I have to remember. So Hi, that is sticky note worthy. I'm going to put that on there.
Good. Okay, so we're almost 30 minutes in. I can't believe it. I have gleaned so much information from you regarding marriage. What else do you suggest? Do you have any other tips or tricks that quick little things that could help a marriage?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that we also had to figure out was we both got to this point where we wanted to work on our marriage. We knew we needed it. We had to figure out that time. But our ways of communicate are not communicating. The ways that we wanted to do that were also different. So I'm a book reader. I was like, babe, let's just read all of these books about marriage. And he hates reading. And so we also had to figure out how to get on the same page of how to pour into our marriage. And I think sometimes that's skimmed over. So I would recommend, like, if you guys aren't going to be book readers, or if he's an audio type of person, that's what we did. So I read a book and he listened to the book, and we were able to communicate about the things and the content that we were learning. We got these intimacy cards that were like, we got them on Amazon, and they were just conversations starters to help you learn more about your spouse, because sometimes you just get in that everyday rut and you stop learning about your spouse. And so they were, they ranged from childhood experiences to hopes and dreams to things to do daily together. And that was also something that we loved doing together. And then we have a calendar. A friend of ours got us this calendar, and I wish I could tell you the name of it.
Mhm.
I want to say it's just called the Family Planner, Weekly Family Planner, but it's been amazing. So it's only every week, but it has like your week broken up, and then it has prayer requests, has chores to get done, a grocery list, special events, meal planning on it. And so we sit down on Sundays and we go over it all together, and it helps us get on that same page of communication, because we will have weeks where we have a lot going on, and Jake could say, okay, Erica, this week we have so much going on. Next week, can you stop scheduling things for us to do? And then I can respectfully say, yes, of course,
Okay.
I will give us a week of rest. So being able to sit down and look at your guys' schedules together is also a tool that I recommend that's been really impactful for our marriage.
Mhm. That's good. Sometimes I've even like when I felt sometimes there's times in your marriage or seasons perhaps where you just feel very disconnected. And it's not just because of fostering, it's just you're in an ebb and flow. And I've felt maybe almost dismissed, but
Mm-hmm.
I would write him a letter and I just leave it for him, like to take to work and read it
Mm-hmm.
after he gets to work, before he gets out of the truck or whatever. Just because sometimes I feel like writing for me lets me think through what I'm trying to explain without being naggy or
Mm-hmm.
self-centered or whatever. I'm just trying to communicate that I need XYZ, and I'm sorry I have been ABC with you.
Right.
Um, so that comes back to texting too. Like you could text, like, we really need to have a
Mm-hmm.
conversation tonight. And then immediately he's like, What do we need to talk about? What is it? I'm like, no, 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 we're going to talk about it tonight. No, what is it? And the same thing with him. If he texts me and says something like, I need to talk to you about something, I'm like, now, I need to know now. But that would be good. Like if your husband and you, maybe you don't feel like you're on the same page, you could write a letter, send him an
Mm-hmm.
email, just text and say, after the kids go to bed, we really need to have a little talk.
Yeah.
Um, just to open the door to what is our plan? What are our goals for our family? Like, what are we doing? Are we going to take another placement when this is done?
Right.
Do we need a break? That kind
I
of
think
stuff.
having those really hard conversations is
Mhm.
important, because in your foster care journey, you have to make challenging decisions of taking more placements, or if a placement is really causing disruption to your other children or to your marriage, what are we going to do? And having, I think, going back to one of your very first questions about what to do before you have a placement, talk about the things that are going to be like non-negotiables in your marriage, because those have to be there. We had a girl who we love her now. We loved her then, but she caused a lot of harm, just because of her own trauma. It wasn't her, it was her behaviors. Her behaviors caused a lot of trauma in our marriage, and that was a boundary that we had to put up. And unfortunately, we had to have a replacement because we had that conversation prior of, okay, if this happens, or this happens, we have to make sure we're putting our marriage first. And so having those boundaries in place prior to taking placements is always a great idea. Another thing that popped in my mind when you were talking was, when you feel that disconnect, chances are your spouse is also going to be feeling those ways. So I've been trying lately to say, okay, if I'm feeling this way, good chance Jake is going to. So I know we all have different love languages. Read the 5 love languages. But what is it that I want Jake to do for me that would help me feel more connected or heard, or whatever it is, the issue I'm having. And then that's what I would try to do for him. And 9 times out of 10, if I take that first step, he reciprocates it, and we then have better communication. So trying to, guide yourself and put your spouse first sometimes feels really hard, because you're like, I just need you to hear me. I need you to be the one to plan or to ask or to do. And that's very real. But I think sometimes it's also helpful just to say, okay, I have to be the one to do it first. And that I have found in my marriage that can be really helpful as well.
Yeah. And while you were talking about all that, I was just thinking about intimacy as well. Like the communication almost mirrors the intimacy aspect of marriage. And so when you're feeling disconnected, maybe mine's an emotional connection, maybe a disconnect. His maybe a physical disconnection, because you don't have the opportunity as much, because you're so exhausted, to just be, intimate with your spouse. Or there may be kids who stay up all night, or they don't go to bed on time, and just makes things more difficult. But if you're talking about it and you're saying, well, I know it's a problem and we're going to work to fix it, and just schedule that time to be together, whether you get a babysitter or, however you can make it happen, because that is a big part of marriage as well.
Yeah. And I think having the mindset to fight for your marriage. I didn't have that mindset until I had to fight for my marriage. If you can be in the mindset of wanting to always fight for your marriage, I would say there's a good chance then that you'll never, maybe not never, but the chances of you having to fight for your marriage is going to be low, because when your marriage is first and that's what you want to fight for, that's the person you want to do life with, that's who you want to lift up and build up and encourage and do all the things with, then having to fight for your marriage is hopefully going to be at a lower risk. And so just trying to intentionality. And I know I listen to so many podcasts and I read so many books, and it's always intentionality. But if you're going to pick one area of your life to really be intentional in, it's going to be your marriage.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for all your wisdom. You're wise beyond your years.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, thank you from Impressing Minds, and we will talk to you later.
Bye.